Alrighty. Well, hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Monterey Bay Aquarium and the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute's social media feeds live. Coming to you right now from Monterey. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. My name is Patrick. I work at the aquarium in social media. Joining me from her home a few miles away across the bay is Emily. Emily, how you doing this afternoon?
I'm fantastic, Patrick. Thank you so much for asking. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in this afternoon with us for is this the third or the fourth one in our deep sea chat series, Patrick? I've lost
Yeah,
count.
I think it's the third one here, and we are so excited to be able to spend this afternoon with all of you folks tuning in from wherever you may be around the world. We are currently going to be talking about the amazing world of bioluminescence, or animals making their own light. So if you're just tuning in right now, this is Mysteries of the Deep here, and we are going to be talking to an MBARI researcher. The Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, by the way, is that term you may be hearing us refer to. MBARI, that's the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. Let's introduce our colleagues over at the mouth of the Monterey Bay, shall we? Because we are so fortunate here in the Monterey Bay to have access to a truly remarkable habitat just offshore here in the Monterey Bay. You can see there, MBARI is located at the mouth of the Monterey Submarine Canyon. Basically, think about it as if there was the Grand Canyon underwater out here in the Monterey Bay. You've got the canyon is about a mile deep from rim to its deepest point, and then you've got another mile of water stacked on top of that. So we're looking at about 2 miles deep of water out here in the Monterey Bay. And that's where MBARI is taking a lot of time and effort to study what is going on out here in this deep sea. The deep sea is the largest habitat that we have on our ocean planet. It was Earth Day yesterday, and most of Earth is ocean. And so we have a whole lot of amazing researchers around the world and here at MBARI heading out to study that deep sea. You're seeing right here the Rachel Carson, one of our research vessels, and you're seeing here the Western Flyer. And aboard these vessels are incredible robots known as ROVs, or remotely operated vehicles. This one here is the ROV Ventana. This one here is the ROV Doc Ricketts, named in homage to the popular Steinbeck character you may know from Cannery Row. And these ROVs go down into the deep sea with scientific equipment and cameras. Most importantly for our uses today, these cameras are recording the HD videos that we will be streaming to all of you of these amazing animals that we find out here in the deep. And aboard the vessels are the pilots of the ROVs and the scientists that are watching in real time what is going on down there in the deep sea. And without further ado, we would like to introduce you to our scientist who will be joining us here this afternoon, Dr. Steve Haddock, who is currently represented by that anglerfish on the lower right corner there of the screen. Steve, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing well, Patrick. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, believe I think I can hear you. Emily, how are we looking in the chat? Can we hear Steve okay there?
It looks like it. If you can hear Steve in chat right now, let us know. Looks like we can hear on and Facebook and YouTube. They're all saying, yep, excellent.
They're
Thank you so much.
all saying yes. That's awesome. Well, Steve, it is so great to have you here, especially if you folks are tuning in right now on MBARI's YouTube channel. You might recognize the dulcet tones of Dr. Steve from many of the videos that appear on that channel. And Steve, you're going to be talking to us about something really quite unique and extraordinary about animals that we're finding in the deep sea here, and that is bioluminescence. And right now, I have a dunce cap jelly up on screen that was making a little bit of its own light. I've got a dragonfish here on screen showing its belly. Can you, first of all, maybe tell us what your role is at MBARI, and then get us going here on bioluminescence and our topic for today?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a scientist at MBARI. I guess you could call me a marine biologist. And I work on all things gelatinous, as well as some of their bio-optical properties. Bio-optical meaning just light phenomena that are associated with living organisms. And so today I really wanted to share with you some of the research and the discoveries that we're making in the deep sea on these organisms and figuring out how and why they're able to make their own light.
Awesome. Yeah, and right now I have up on screen there a siphonophore, which is a cousin to a stinging jellyfish that folks at home may know. Now I have up on screen a dancing bristle worm that we talked about a lot in the previous episodes here. And you can see here in this next video that it is producing its own light. That's that term that you'll be hearing a lot today, bioluminescence, or animal light, living light. So these animals are making their own light. You folks may be familiar with maybe some glow-in-the-dark mushrooms that you folks may have seen walking through the woods, or fireflies are probably the best known example of bioluminescence that we have on land. But in the deep sea, bioluminescence is very typical. And so with that, Steve, I'm gonna see if I can seamlessly tab over to your presentation here on the topic of bioluminescence, and we'll get started. How's that sound?
Sounds great.
All right. And Emily, are you seeing any questions that we should know ahead of time before we head into the other show?
Very excited about the images that we have up on the screen, and curious about the difference between bioluminescence and fluorescence, which
Ooh,
we're going to talk about. So, yep.
That's excellent.
That
Awesome.
happens to be one of my favorite topics there.
Well, so Steve, we have you now here up on screen with your bioluminescence lecture. That I got your keynote lined up. I'll be making a few tweaks here as we go, but yeah, we can get started right now. We're looking at a whole bunch of wonderful gelatinous animals here on screen, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So a lot of the things that we are interested in at the Institute, because we have these great ROVs that can go down and collect organisms, a lot of them are the really fragile ones that you can't catch if you just try to use a net or some kind of other method to collect them. And what's kind of crazy about all these is that they're not really closely related to each other, but many of them become transparent and become, have very fragile body forms because they live in this vast open ocean ecosystem. And what the ROVs allow us to do is to collect them in really, really good conditions so that they actually have their natural behaviors like bioluminescence intact. If you're too rough with these organisms when you collect them and bring them to the surface, they may be able to be bioluminescent, but the one that you just collected is not, because it's been so beat up, on the way up to the ship. Right. So we do a lot of collections with the ROVs. We also use scuba diving even to catch things in the shallow waters to study them. And this capability has allowed us to make a bunch of discoveries about who is bioluminescent in the ocean and actually how they make that bioluminescence that people were never able to study before because they couldn't get the animals alive and intact.
Gotcha. And right now, I just wanted to point out to anyone who might be watching at home there that shout out to, I believe you were saying, Steve, that this is our own Wyatt Petrie from our jelly team that is doing some midwater collection right there on that video that we just played. So shout out to Wyatt, and that's that collection that you were mentioning there to allow these animals to stay nice and intact there, so we can study their bioluminescence, right?
Yep. So we call this method blue water diving, probably for obvious reasons. The water's not always that blue. When we're in the bay itself, it's pretty green and can be pretty murky. But when we get offshore or even out to Hawaii, you get into this beautiful sort of sapphire water. And it's a really fun way to go to the office in the day. And Wyatt often comes on our cruises, and we work closely with the aquarium to both collect and keep alive a lot of these fragile organisms.
Oh, well, that's awesome. Well, shout out to Wyatt. And then, these collections allow us to study the essence of those animals in a few senses of the term. So I'm on to your next slide here to discuss, bioluminescence. There's a few different parts to the term, and Emily brought up fluorescence, bioluminescence. There's that essence in there. So we're on to that next slide.
Yeah. So I call these the essences, and they're oftentimes confused, and you'll see people use these two terms interchangeably. So I like to try to define them up front. So we have both fluorescence and bioluminescence, and they're closely related, but they're somewhat distinct phenomena. There's actually sometimes you'll hear this term biofluorescence, which is like a mashup of those two terms, and that's essentially fluorescence. It's just, to me, it's confusing if you um, just if you call it biofluorescence, it just confuses people. So let's just stick to fluorescence and bioluminescence. Um, the way that you tell the difference between these two things is to switch off the lights. Is one way. And in complete darkness, if you've got an organism or some substance that is doesn't have any lights on, if you see light coming out of that, then it's going to be bioluminescence, because bioluminescence gets its energy from a chemical reaction that's happening inside the animals, and it allows them to make these flashes or glows of light just in their own tissues. Fluorescence, I don't know if you're on the slide yet, but fluorescence is one where you have to shine a light on the thing, and it turns the light that you are providing into a different color of light. So with fluorescence, you're not going to see it in total darkness. You have to shine a light, like a UV or a blue light, on it, and then you'll get out fluorescence emission by transforming that light into a different color, usually a longer wavelength. Now, what gets really confusing is that bioluminescence can be the light that excites the fluorescence. And so in many animals, actually, they have both bioluminescent and fluorescent molecules together. So I understand why people get these terms kind of mixed up, but in that situation, which happens in jellyfish and in other organisms, the organism would normally put out blue light, but because it has these fluorescent pigments, it can put out green or yellow or some other color of light. So those are those two terms. They're really pretty abundant phenomena in the ocean. If you go to the video, so this is a video of, we took a trawl net, like one of these nets that collects just a soup of organisms from the water, and then we're going to pour it into this container and release all the animals into that container. And you can see that there's just like tons and tons of them are producing their own light when they get stimulated by us pouring them in there. You can see that there's blue light, green light. They can make a bunch of different colors and really long-lived glows. And that just gives you an idea of how predominant the luminescence is in the deep sea. What we did was we took the ROV, we took our subs, and we have a catalog that gets annotated all the things that you saw. Like at this depth, I saw jellyfish, here I saw shrimp, here I saw fish. So we took that database and we compared it to a database of things that are bioluminescent. And when we did that, we found that about 3/4 of the things that we were seeing in the ocean with our ROV in the water column were bioluminescence. So it's extremely common out there, especially as you go into the deep sea. And even that ratio doesn't change. So if you're near the surface, there's still about 3/4 bioluminescent organisms. If you go all the way down, about 3/4 of the animals you'll see are bioluminescent. So it's really widespread and common. So how do they, what's happening inside of these organisms to be able to make the light? They have a little light emitting chemical in them, and then they have other sets of proteins that can let them turn on and off that light. In this case, with jellies, a lot of times they have one that's activated by calcium. So when calcium gets released next to that molecule, it'll actually trigger light to come out. And if you look in the one example of an organism that uses it like this is this Sculophore burrowii. It's almost one of our lab rats. We can't really keep it too long in captivity, but it's really good for doing experiments. And in this picture, actually, you see those rainbow colors. That's not the bioluminescence. That's another essence called iridescence. But burrowii can produce this blue bioluminescent waves of light using those they're called photoproteins, those proteins triggered by calcium. And you can just see the kinetics, the timing of those flashes that the ctenophore is able to make.
And Steve,
So,
I just
yeah,
wanted
go
to
ahead.
interrupt just very quickly. Just the fact that it's calcium that's activating that, it would really make for different got milk ads back in the day if we were doing it in the deep sea, right? I just wanted to point that out very quickly to
That's
the folks
true.
out there, that it would be
And
yeah.
people actually did use it as a calcium detector in other systems like fertilized eggs, and in other disciplines. There's a lot of biotech spin-offs where people use these molecules to highlight whatever phenomenon they are of interested in. So, if you wanted to make a milk detector, this would actually be probably a good way to go about it.
All right. Sorry for interrupting for bad jokes.
No worries.
I can't
Yeah,
promise
please do.
I can't promise it won't happen
Yeah.
again, but okay. So, yes, the
On the way.
bioluminescence of the burrowee.
If we look at all the different, or many of the different organisms that make light, they actually use different chemicals as the light emitter. So you think of like a firefly, it's not the same chemistry as a firefly, but we still call it a luciferin, the light emitting molecule of luciferin. But what's kind of weird to me, at least in the ocean, is that you have all these organisms, all the white names there, and they're only using really a few different chemicals to make light. So a whole bunch of them use this same one molecule as their light emitter, even though they're not related to each other. So jellyfish and shrimp and squid and fish, and all these things are using that same light emitting molecule. And it was really a curious phenomenon. Go ahead and pop to the next.
Yep.
So we actually worked with the aquarium to try to figure out where that pattern comes from, why all these organisms got the same light emitter. And the aquarium had this one jellyfish called Aquaria. It was in captivity, and that's actually the one that this light emitter was first discovered from. So it's a really good experimental subject. And what we found was that the ones that were living in the aquarium couldn't make bioluminescence anymore. They lost the ability to make light. And when we provided them with bioluminescence, they were suddenly able to make light. They had the infrastructure, like they had the support cells and stuff in order to do it. They just were lacking in that energy source to make light. So what we concluded from this is that they're actually getting it from their diet. And once you realize that, it shows that you can explain a lot of these patterns of it being distributed all around. But if they're eating something that's bioluminescent and they're borrowing the chemicals from that other organism, then that helps explain how it's so widespread in the environment. So one of the projects that we're working on now is to figure out where in the food chain that is being synthesized, because you can ultimately, we're trying to figure out what the genes are that allow them to produce that light emitting chemical. Another organism that we're really interested in studying the chemistry of is this bristleworm. It's called Tomopteris. Can be up to a foot long, but usually they're just a couple inches long, or a few centimeters long. And what's fascinating about this one is that instead of making the blue or blue-green light that we usually see, this one makes yellow bioluminescence. It's one of the few things in the ocean that makes yellow bioluminescence. And it also, it doesn't use any of the known chemicals to make that light. So we're trying to figure out the chemistry of that yellow emitting light production. It's one of the ongoing topics that we're working on in our research lab. So there's a lot of mysteries still. There's a lot of unanswered questions still about the chemistry of how they make the light. I would say there's even more questions about why a lot of these organisms make the light. Why is it so widespread and distributed among such a diversity of species, everything from bacteria and single-celled organisms up to starfish and things that you might not expect to be bioluminescent. So I categorized a lot of the hypotheses about the functions of bioluminescence into offensive and defensive categories. Most of them are defensively oriented, so trying to deter a predator or hide from a predator. maybe a lot of them seem to use it like a little smoke screen, so they can drop a body part, like lizards drop their tail to distract something. Things can drop a glowing body part in the ocean and swim away and try to regrow that back later. But again, a lot of these are really just so stories. We think this is plausible, but it's really hard to get experimental evidence for any of that. I think people are more familiar with some of the offensive functions, like the anglerfish, for example, where they have a little street lamp hanging out there, and their prey. If you want to eat a moth, then put a lamp out at night, and the moths will come flock to your lamp. So anglerfish do that, but there's really not a whole lot of other examples of that. I'll give you another example in a second of an organism that does that. For camouflage, a lot of the fish and shrimp and squid that we see have their photophores along their bellies. And this is being used for what's called counter illumination. So this video is from one that we had on the ship, but it shows you the pattern of light organs distributed along the body of this fish. And what they use that for is to as like a cloaking device. So they're living in this environment where there's dim blue light coming down from above, and they don't want to have a shadow cast. They don't want something to look up and be able to see their silhouette. So we set up in the laboratory an experiment with some fish that have these little lights on the bottom. And when we turn the overhead light on, one of the fish would turn on its cloaking device, and the other one would not turn it on. So it left a shadow where you could see the dark fish swimming around, but the illuminated fish just disappeared into the background. And organisms that use that strategy are actually pretty amazingly sophisticated. They'll match the intensity, but they'll also match the color and the angular distribution of the light. In other words, they don't want the light that they turn on to be shining out to the side, because that could attract something else instead of just blocking out their silhouette. So I mentioned the anglerfish with the lures trying to attract prey. We actually also discovered that there is this other organism called a siphonophore, which uses bioluminescence to attract its prey. And these siphonophores, they're related to jellies. They can be really long, tens of meters long. They have these tentacles hanging down, and the tentacles have stinging cells. They look sort of fluffy and soft like a feather boa, but actually those are all stinging cells, and they're really painful. These guys specialize in eating fish, and they have bioluminescent filled lures that they twitch right next to where their stinging cells are. So in the deep sea, where fish might not be all that abundant, these guys take the offensive and try to attract fish to them using their bioluminescence. A lot of organisms use luminescence also in multiple ways. The vampire squid is one example of that, where it has some light organs on the back of its mantle that look sort of like headlights. But then it also has light organs on the tips of its tentacles. And these, as the tentacle tapers down there, the suckers become ineffective, and they're surrounded by this bioluminescent particles. So when the vampire squid gets disturbed and it flares its umbrella around, you can see its tentacle tips glowing, but also at the same time, it's releasing luminous fluid into the water. So it's like an octopus inking, but the ink in this sense would be bioluminescent ink, because these guys are relatively slow moving. So they have this cloud to hopefully or presumably distract predators from attacking them. There's another worm that also does something similar, which we discovered. This was one of those things where, you don't know what's going to come out of it, but you just look at animals under the microscope on the ship late night. And in this case, I saw these weird, to me, very suspicious, like bright green, like nodules on the sides of its head. And I called them bombs, like green bombs. And it turned out those are filled with bioluminescent material. So this is another organism that is able to shed these bombs of light into the water as they go and escape. And actually, my son is now, he's into octonauts, and they just watched the bomber worm episode, and they do a really good job of getting this sort of gist of these worms, the way they swim, and they have their little bombs. So it's kind of funny to go from being on board the ship, years ago, and having that end up being in a little animated kids show. So those are some examples of the hows and whys of bioluminescence. But I think equally interesting is this phenomenon of fluorescence. And it's not quite as widespread in the ocean, but it still is pretty widespread. And again, the way that fluorescence works is that you need a photon of light to come in and excite this molecule. In this animation, it's shown as like a single atom exciting that electron up. The electron's not happy up there in that higher energy state, so it falls back down to its original thing and it re-releases that energy. But because that's not 100% efficient reaction, you get a change in the color of light from the more energetic light to less energetic. So we'll often excite with blue light and get out green, yellow, orange, red. Now to take pictures of this, we can put in a yellow filter and block out that short wavelength part of the spectrum. And so you just see the longer fluorescence. So the videos and the images that we're going to show you are taken with this condition where we just have the camera and then put a yellow filter over it while we're exciting the light. So first one is if, and these were shot actually in the aquarium, by the way, after hours, but this is sort of a drab looking brown coral, but when we shine blue light on it, you can see that it actually, inside of it, it has these fluorescent proteins. So things look very different in white light, or how we might expect them, than they do in their own ambient environment. Even in tide pools, like in an intertidal scene with strawberry anemones and sea anemones and all these organisms that look to us to be colorful pink and reds and oranges. When you turn out the lights and shine the fluorescent light source on them, they completely change colors and you get these neon highlights. So the source of the fluorescence in a lot of these organisms is a molecule called green fluorescent protein. And we cloned a bunch of those genes for that from the strawberry anemone. And if you put that gene into bacteria, they'll turn into a little protein factory for you. And they can crank out these little tubes of fluorescent protein for you. And researchers soon realized, when this was discovered, that they could use this in the lab to highlight any other phenomenon that they're interested in. So for example, you could have tumor cells that were fluorescent inside of an organism, and you could assess how effective your treatment was without having to dissect or sacrifice the animal. You could look at it and see where the fluorescence was and know that that's where the tumor was. So there's lots of applications for it, and it actually, the discovery of that green fluorescent protein, originally from a jellyfish, ended up in getting the Nobel Prize for a lot of the researchers who were working on that. So that kind of explains why it's maybe interesting to people, but to the organisms, we wanted to figure out why are the organisms using it. So we put a blue light on our ROVs so that we could fly around with like a fluorescence vision and see fluorescence from the animals in situ. So if you look at a jellyfish swimming by, for example, with the white lights on, you get your normal view, but it's not necessarily the natural view. And if we switch to blue light mode on that jelly swimming by, you can see it'll highlight this ring of fluorescence around the margin of the jelly. So that's a shot from the ROV. We can also do it in an aquarium where we have a bunch of these jellies, and you can see these little kind of lava lampy looking phenomena of these jellies swimming around with their fluorescence highlighted. So this led to another series of experiments that we did actually with the aquarium as well, where we were trying to figure out why some of these animals have fluorescent structures. And so we used this thing called the flower hat jellyfish, which is a really beautiful jelly. In white light, the pink parts are conspicuous, but those are actually pink because they're absorbing blue light. So they're actually dark in a blue lit environment. But it also has these fluorescent portions of the tentacle that are really brightly fluorescent when you have blue light on it. So in the natural environment, that's probably actually more how it looks. So we put these in a tank. We had a clear barricade between it, and then we put a little juvenile fish on the other side so that it couldn't actually get stung. And we put an opaque barrier in front of the jelly in between the fish, and then we would sort of start this time trial of removing the barrier and seeing what the fish did. So if we had white light on, it was, not very interested. If we had yellow light on, it didn't excite the fluorescence and it wasn't super interested. But if we put the blue light on there where the tentacles were fluorescent and kind of bobbing around, then the fish would go and actually strike at the glass and try to get at those little blue tentacle tips that were waving around. So again, this is like that lure with the siphonophore that uses bioluminescence, but in this case, it's using fluorescence. So it needs the ambient blue light in order to make itself visible. And once we noticed this phenomenon in that jelly, started to see it in other organisms that were also potentially using fluorescence in the same way. So there's these tube anemones that have all their fluorescence is located right in the center of their mouth, like in the junction of all those tentacles. And so I think this is another example of using fluorescence to attract prey, although we don't have experimental evidence in this case to support that. So just because something this fluorescent, though, doesn't necessarily mean that that is serving a fluorescence related function. So you can see there's like shrimp, the exoskeleton or the shell of a lot of shrimp and crustaceans can have a lot of bright fluorescence, and that shrimp is sitting on a piece of seaweed that has red fluorescence from its chlorophyll. There have been reports of like fluorescent puffin beaks and fluorescent turtle shells and the algae growing on turtle shells. Those I think are not really serving a particular function related to their fluorescence. So if you look even at a human, for example, if you look at our hands or the lenses of our eyes, our teeth, they're all fluorescent as well. So if you shine UV light on your own hand, you'll see your fingernails light up, and that doesn't mean that there's some fluorescence function associated with your fingernails. So the last thing I wanted to show you with these slides is we did those experiments in the lab to show how fluorescence worked to attract prey, but we wanted to confirm that in the field. So we took a green laser pointer, put it in a little underwater housing, and then swam around. This happened to be on the Great Barrier Reef, but tried it in other places where there's clear water. And you could see the laser beam as a little dot of green light on the seafloor, pretty conspicuous. And the fish and other organisms just pretty much went crazy for it. The things that were out there hunting for little obscure prey, this was like an overwhelming stimulus for them. We call it a super normal stimulus, where they're spending all their days trying to hunt down something. So if you were trying to attract those fish, then fluorescence would really be a great way to try to do it. So those are some of the things that we're working on, some of our observations with fluorescence and bioluminescence, which is actually, it's really abundant, and for reasons that we know and also reasons that we don't yet know in the deep sea that we're still working on.
Well, that was tremendous. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us, Steve. I can't imagine that anyone out there has any questions whatsoever about anything that you brought up because you covered it so well. But thank you so much for explaining all of that. Emily, what does the world at large think about bioluminescence, or fluorescence? Don't say biofluorescence. I learned that early on. What does the world at large think about that? Because something that really I think is amazing to think about is that, we think about the deep sea as this dark environment, but that animals down there, they're using light in ways that we don't really think about too much on land. People have probably heard that insects see light differently than we do, or at least they're looking for different visual cues than we are to find flowers, etc. But so something to really take away from this is that the deep sea is certainly not dark, and that light has been weaponized or utilized by so many different types of animals out there to make a living in Earth's largest habitat. And if you were an alien coming down to the planet trying to figure out what's going on with Earthlings, they probably think, well, what's up with all of the weird humans on land that don't make light? It's all the animals that we've met in the deep sea are making their own light. So really an interesting characteristic there. But Emily, tell us, what do the folks think?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people just really excited with the beautiful images of all the animals that we're seeing right now. I think that bioluminescence is definitely something that captures so many people's attention, just with how beautiful it can be. Steve, one of the earliest questions that we had, do you happen to know what the largest animal in the deep sea is that is bioluminescent? I know that we looked at some of those siphonophores. I didn't know if there was a siphonophore that might have been the largest one, or if you can think.
Yeah. So for sure, the longest is probably the siphonophore. They can be, more than 100 feet long and bioluminescent all along the length of it. So there's some of the more impressive ones. I think some of the more massive ones in terms of bulk are like the squids. So I know for sure that Dicidicus, the jumbo squid is. I think Architeuthis is not supposed to be. The giant squid is not bioluminescent. There's another one called Teningia, which is, I don't remember what the common name is, but it actually has these hooks and giant photophores. There was some video that was going around recently showing that the video of that squid that was doing bioluminescent, that was actually reflection because the ROV lights were on. So in the video, it uncloaks its bioluminescent organs and it looks like it's flashing, but that's actually just reflection of light. But those, they do have these Dicidicus that you're showing now, they have photophores all along their belly. And so they do what I was talking about, counter illumination, where they try to block out their silhouettes. And actually, we've done some night scuba dives with these guys, and it's pretty spooky to see a whole wall of them swimming by underwater in the dark.
Wow,
really impressive.
I didn't realize that Humboldt squid have those photophores there as well. That's really something else. Yeah, I can't imagine diving with a squid that's putting on a light show like that. And then maybe just before going to the sorry, I'm failing at my job here. Let me pull up another clip here real quick. Back to the original dunce cap jelly that was making its bioluminescence. But I just wanted to point out that I've heard stories of researchers, colleagues of yours, that used to go down in subs or go diving at night specifically to enjoy the light show that's happening in the deep sea. Can you confirm or deny that there are folks out there that are going to great depths to try to see this bioluminescent light? Because as far as I know, Mr. Beebe and colleagues, when they were first going down into the deepest parts of the ocean, the bioluminescent light show was really one of the defining features that they talked about on their way down, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The trick is to try to get them to turn off the lights and look out the window. If it's in a manned sub, you can't really see them with an ROV, but for sure scuba diving or on these sub dives at night. And I actually asked James Cameron about, he had that dive to the Marianas Trench, and I asked him about bioluminescence on the way down, and he basically didn't look out the window on the way down because he was just conserving, I guess, his own energy. But that's how we've made some of our most interesting discoveries. I think one of the animals that we figured out was bioluminescent that wasn't originally thought to be. I first noticed it just looking out the window of a sub, and it was right outside the window, and it swam away, left a trail of blue sparks in its wake. And so that set off this whole quest to study that system. So it's definitely one of the fun things to experience about both night scuba diving and sub dives. People often play with flashlights. If you shine a light out the window and turn it off and on, or on and off really fast, you'll get organisms responding, or you'll get kind of things glowing in the environment around you.
Wow.
So there's lots of fun that you can have with that.
Wow, that's awesome. Emily, any more questions?
That's a great tie-in to one of the questions that we saw go by, that some people who might be living near coastlines are
Mm-hmm.
familiar with bioluminescence because they'll see these glowing blue waves crashing on the shore. Um, I know we've been talking a lot about some of the macro fauna out there with bioluminescence, but Steve, did you want to talk at all about some of the microfauna and
Yeah,
flora?
definitely. That's usually how people who live on the West Coast don't get to see fireflies really, but sometimes we can see when the ocean is sparkling and glowing and shimmering. Those are caused usually by these things called dinoflagellates. They're considered phytoplankton, so they're single-celled organisms that can photosynthesize, and then they reproduce by dividing, so they can get to large populations really quickly. And I think right now, and just a couple days ago, I saw a report from Huntington Beach that there's blue flashing waves in Southern California. So it's something that is happening to some extent pretty much every day of the year. And then at times it gets to be really, really intense. But so if you see it in the wake of your boat or footprints on the beach, that's probably caused by a bloom of these things called dinoflagellates.
Yeah, and I just so for those of you who were watching there, I had up on screen a black prince copepod, and then it was emitting its bioluminescence. That was just trying to buy me time to pull up this image from a few years ago when there was a bioluminescent bloom in Big Sur. So just around the corner from us. So we're kind of looking towards Carmel here in this image. We got the Milky Way overhead, and then these blue waves there that were breaking from just so much bioluminescence there. It was a big story. I think it was in the New York Times and a few other news outlets about how much bioluminescence was happening in Big Sur there. And just for you folks out there, the camera sees that light as blue, but when I was there taking this photo, everything looked white. It was glowing white because my night vision had kind of kicked in, and so
Right.
I wasn't seeing blue anymore. I was just seeing brightness and darkness. And so if you do go out there, your camera can often see more subtlety of that light than your own eyes can when you're down there.
Yeah, that's a good point. People often say that they saw dim bioluminescence and it looked white. That's because your cones that are responsible for color vision are not as sensitive as your rods, and your rods are essentially black and white receptors. So when you get down into the really low light levels, it starts to look black and white, even though it's really blue.
Yeah, let me see if I can find another image there to transition to. And Emily, what else are the folks wanting to know at
I
home?
was just going to add to that comment, just saying, depending on where you are, that color might be different depending on what is actually bioluminescing out there, kind of like what you were talking about, Steve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I remember being down in Baja, Mexico, and walking along the beach with some of my students and leaving those green footprints as a trail behind us there. So it definitely different colors depending on what's bioluminescing out there. We did have a really interesting question that I'm interested in as well, being an ecologist and evolutionary biologist. Steve, do you know when bioluminescence evolved in animals? Is there a way to actually study that?
Yeah. I mean, mostly we do that through genetics and then building trees of relationships. So if you look at a tree of life and you map bioluminescence onto it, it's really, again, it's really spanning all the way across the tree of life. So that would suggest that it happened a long time ago and has this common ancestry a long time ago, and that all these organisms that descended from that bioluminescent ancestor were bioluminescent. But that doesn't seem to be the case because, for example, in the jellyfish that I talked about, those guys seem to, at least some of them, have evolved their bioluminescence after whatever their prey evolve their bioluminescence because they're getting the chemicals from their diet. So actually now I've come to think that it happened really recently, relatively recently, in lineages. And then we're also doing a lot of genome sequencing from within groups like comb jellies and squids. And in there, you can really reconstruct where the genes that were responsible for bioluminescence came and how closely related they are to other organisms that are related to it. So I think there is a lot of gain and loss that has happened in bioluminescence. And so things that are not bioluminescent their ancestors might have had it. But I think it's more recent than you might assume, given its widespread distribution.
That's awesome. I just found my other image. It was up on screen a little bit earlier, but just for you folks out there wanting to see some more, there you've got all of the stars in the galaxy, in the night sky, looking down when it's a really dark night. And then you've got that bioluminescence there from the plankton there in the ocean. And so you look out into space and it's filled with lights. It's just whether or not we're sensitive enough to see them. And then in the ocean as well, I've gone diving in these clouds where you can see your buddy at a distance without any lights on because they're scintillating. And so just imagine what it's like to be an animal that has to live in this living light show in the ocean. Certainly not what we usually think about as cold and dark and completely devoid of light out there. And excuse me, getting all choked up thinking about all this bioluminescence. And just as you were mentioning, how it's an ongoing process that these animals had light, didn't have light, are evolving to obtain it. There's so much. It's so active out there in how bioluminescence is still being used out there in the ocean. All right, just interrupting for that. And Emily, do we have any more questions out there?
Absolutely. In fact, let's talk about this one since it happened to pull one up right now, Patrick.
Yeah.
One of the questions that we had was about ctenophores. Oftentimes we see these beautiful ctenophores out there with their rainbow lights going down their sides, which we've talked about in the past. That's the diffraction of the light as it's hitting their comb rows on these ctenophores there. But Steve, ctenophores, they also bioluminesce too.
Yeah. So ctenophores have bioluminescence and they have that iridescence. You would only see the iridescence if you're filming it, or taking photos with the bright ROV lights. So I don't think that actually has a function, but they're one of the groups that we're really drilling down and comparing genomes to see, because there's one lineage of ctenophores, it's actually a really common one, the sea gooseberries, that is not able to produce bioluminescence. And so we're looking at which genes they lost and using that as a clue to figure out how bioluminescence evolves. But in general, there's some of the brightest and just most persistent, most long-lived organisms that produce bioluminescence. But that said, what's funny is that we don't really know very well what that function of it is in ctenophores. We have some guesses as to maybe making it dangerous to eat them. If you bite off a piece of bioluminescent tissue and it's glowing in your stomach, it exposes you to other predators. So a burrowee just went by on this screen that had a red gut. A lot of organisms in the sea have this red pigment that absorbs blue light of the prey that they've ingested. It's just an extra safety margin that they use when they're eating something that is glowing.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. All right, Emily, next question. And maybe it seems like it's almost time for rapid fire questions here, where we run Dr. Steve through the rapid fire questions from the folks at large. What do you think?
All right, yeah, we can definitely do that. Are you ready?
Dr. Steve?
Oh, maybe.
You're controlling the video here.
I'm ready. I've got my switcher fingers at the ready. We'll just see. Yeah, we'll do some rapid fire question and answer here.
All right. Are barrel eye spookfishes bioluminescent?
I don't think the barrel eye itself is, but there are other related species that are bioluminescent with counter illumination. The cool thing about the barrel eye is that the eyes that tilt, they have yellow filters on them, and they're looking up to try to pick out silhouettes. So they're a really good example of something that hunts by trying to track down silhouettes.
Awesome. All right. Next rapid fire question. Does temperature or salinity in the ocean affect bioluminescence?
In the range of natural salinities, it doesn't seem to have an effect. If we have chemicals in the lab and we put them in different salt conditions, it can affect the properties. But with the range of variation in the ocean, it doesn't seem to. Temperature, likewise, most of the color variation, at least, is determined by the proteins sequence itself. And it could affect the speed of the reaction, the kinetics essentially of how fast a flash occurs. But things that are living in 1.5 degrees, colder than your refrigerator, are still able to make bioluminescence in the deep sea.
Wow.
That's great. And then next rapid fire question. This is a popular one right now. Lots of people asking, do you have a favorite bioluminescent organism?
Who's my favorite child? Let's see. I mean, I do. So I like the arrowworms that I found in the submarine. Of course, I like the ctenophores a lot. They just have such dramatic and impressive bioluminescence. And I mean, there's just too many, really. It's too hard to pick. The yellow ones, the siphonophore with the lures, green bombers. There's too many. I
yeah,
can't
and hopefully none of them are watching the live stream right now. So you don't want to say this is definitely not my favorite, and then you never see it ever again because it's
Right.
so hurt by this presentation. So yeah, definitely.
No, there are a lot of great ones, but I can't pick this one.
Awesome.
All right. I know that we kind of touched on this question before, but a lot of people curious about how animals in the deep sea see light differently than us humans with our eyes. So how do we imagine this bioluminescence looks to them?
So for the most part, our color range is more than what they have. They'll have one or maybe two visual pigments, so that they'll be keying in mostly on the intensity of the light. But there are some pretty remarkable exceptions. One is these dragonfish, like the loose jaw dragonfish. It has a red light organ that's underneath its eyeball, and that's really, really long wavelength red. So it's actually hard to see for us to see the bioluminescence, because it's almost getting out into the periphery of our sensitivity. But they have pigments in their eyes that are especially sensitive to that light, so they can swim around with this night vision scope, shining their lights out looking for prey while the prey don't know that they're being illuminated. So that's one example where they definitely have a different sensory range than we're able to see.
That's one of my favorite bioluminescence stories, by the way, is this particular animal that has that red bioluminescence, and it's a two-part system, right? As far as I understand, it's blue green being shifted by a filter, right?
Yeah, and actually, it's a little bit longer than blue green, but yeah, it does have a filter, and it actually has fluorescence in there as well to modify the wavelength.
That's fascinating. And those are those red headlamps underneath the eyes there for the folks that are watching there. So if you were a red animal hoping to use that to hide in the deep sea with the absence of red light and with just blue lights shining around you, this fish has night vision goggles coming after you. So yeah, awesome. Thank you for bringing that one up. One of my favorite bioluminescence stories there. Great. Emily, what? Yeah, go for it.
No, I think that this is also a very popular question right now. Steve, can we become bioluminescent? I think
Ooh.
that a lot of people are looking at all these beautiful displays of the animals in the deep sea going, man, I wish I could do that.
Well, so people are sort of working on that. I have a friend who's made um, like bioluminescent squirt guns and lollipops and bath bubbles and things like that. At this point, it requires these two chemicals, and we don't have a good source for the light emitting chemical, so you can't really make genetically modified people. You could do things like fluorescent tattoos if you wanted to just be fluorescent, but I think I wouldn't recommend it at this point.
Okay, sorry to destroy so many dreams in an instant there of anyone tuning in. Not quite yet for your own bioluminescence kit at home, but excellent.
Definitely fluorescent kits though.
Yeah,
Get
yeah,
yourself
that's
light
something.
and, yeah, some highlighters or something like
Yeah,
that.
it's like
Yeah,
when you leave the aquarium and you get your little stamp on your arm that doesn't show up unless you shine the purple light on it.
Oh, there you go.
exactly. So we're making people fluorescent, one hand stamp at a time.
That's
Yeah.
true. It looks like maybe we have, time for one or two more questions here before we wrap it up. So, folks, go ahead and send in those questions. Emily, give us our second to last inquiry here for Dr. Steve.
We had someone ask, do we know of any instances of fluorescent teeth in organisms?
So can you say that again? Fluorescent what?
Teeth.
Oh, teeth. Oh, like to attract something to your mouth.
Yeah.
Um,
The mouth is on like the, sea anemones and stuff, but those aren't really teeth that are glowing.
right,
That's
right.
where their mouth is.
So there's nothing that I've seen where the teeth are fluorescent above background. Actually, like I mentioned before, a lot of skeletons are a little bit fluorescent under the right conditions. So human teeth, there's some good images online. If you go to Night Sea, there's this company called Night Sea, and they have pictures of fluorescent teeth in humans. But I don't think any animals have done that. There was a report. So this Megamouth shark, it's this sort of prehistoric looking giant shark that's like a filter feeding shark. People had speculated that had fluorescence. Bioluminescence inside of its mouth. But that has somewhat been debunked. But it would be a good way to attract things, to just open your mouth and let the glow do its job.
We don't have a Megamouth shark, but we do have this 6-gill shark video, so I'm just going to put that up right there. This is not a bioluminescent shark, but it's a shark.
Close.
Just wanted to put that up on screen.
There are bioluminescent sharks, though. Like the cookie
Yes.
cutter shark and the little cigar sharks are bioluminescent.
Absolutely.
There's also fluorescence in sharks too.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I might have that.
That photo, Patrick.
I might have that photo. Yeah, here. Let's see if I can get to it before before
All right,
that
well,
video
while you
ends.
I'll throw another question out there for Dr. Steve. We have, so many people online right now very excited about learning about bioluminescence, about the deep sea. Do you have any recommendations, any advice for students right now who are looking into getting into studying the deep sea and the ocean?
And I found the images very quickly. Yes, sorry to interrupt. There it is, everyone. If you were wondering, there is that fluorescent swell shark that we have here at the aquarium. And I am now getting out of the way of your answer, Steve. Go for it.
Well, I want to address so I think the fluorescent sharks is really more like fluorescent human fingernails. I think it's a property of their skin. The molecules that they use for their skin, maybe not so functional, but
right.
Advice for people wanting to study. I think a lot of one thing I would say is that there's still a lot of unanswered questions. Don't feel like everything has been discovered. There's plenty of things to work on and plenty of exciting discoveries to make. I think the basic tools that we use are really the same as a lot of other disciplines. So chemistry, if you're a really good chemist, a lot of people are getting into molecular biology, but in my sense, less so to chemistry. And some of our most important breakthroughs are being made by biochemists working on the luminescence reactions. So studying chemistry, but then also the genomics and transcriptomics, our ability to take, one tiny organism from the deep sea and learn all we need to know about how it makes its bioluminescence and fluorescence by sequencing its genome. It's really, like an environmentally conscious way to do your work, and it gives us a lot of insight. So learning about molecular biology and biochemistry probably would be the easiest ways to make a contribution to the fields.
Wonderful.
That's awesome. Okay.
Well, it is
Yeah,
3
go for it.
o'clock, Patrick.
What time is it? Sorry.
It's 3 o'clock.
Oh my goodness. It is 3 o'clock, everyone. That means that you have spent another perfectly fine hour with all of us here learning about the deep sea and all of the amazing animals that we can be very proud to call neighbors on our ocean planet here. Still so much to discover. This is barely scratching the surface of the topic of bioluminescence. So Steve, will definitely need to have you back on to answer any follow-up questions that the folks may have at home. But very quickly, if the folks in the chat could just give a big, big, big thank you to Dr. Steve Haddock from MBARI for being here on the stream with us today. Thank you so much, Steve, for spending an hour answering all of those questions and really walking us through bioluminescence today, one of those key features, one of the highlights, as it were, of the deep sea. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, really illuminating some things.
Very illuminating, yes.
Yes, thanks for having me. That was fun.
Awesome. Emily, thank you so much for talking to or seeing what the folks were talking about at home. Thanks for being there on the other end of the stream as well.
Happy to be here.
All righty.
Thank you, Patrick, for helping to pull up all those images and, acquiescing to my little glowing request there at the end.
Of course. And of course, I figured out what was happening with our cropping issues kind of about 5 minutes into the stream. So we'll have that fixed for next time, everyone, in case you're watching the replay here and wondering what was going on. We got it figured out. But thank you so much, everyone, for spending an hour with us here learning about the mysteries of the deep that are happening right here in our ocean backyard. Thank you again to MBARI for all this amazing video footage, for all the science happening over there. Thank you to Steve for being here with us. And thank you all so much for you for being a part of the ocean-minded community. And we hope to deep see you all again soon. Thank you so much for watching, everyone.